What's going on, guys? So today I'm doing a video, obviously not professionally looking. For those of you who are listening, you're obviously not going to be able to see this, but yeah, just started to do a video regards to just sitting here on the couch. And the reason I wanted to do today's video is because I actually had a question that come up when I posted yesterday on Instagram. So basically I was talking about how when it comes to my training at the moment, I'm doing some double sessions a day. I'm doing some single sessions a day. I'm just gonna pop this down here. And so, the single sessions that I'm doing at the moment, they're in the morning and usually they're fasted cardio sessions for the most part. And I was saying the reason that I do fasted cardio is because at the end of the day, if we are doing some fasted cardio training, you can actually get better training adaptations overall. And as I was talking about this on Instagram, I was saying, so basically the reason we are doing fasted training some mornings, basically on an empty stomach and just with caffeine, and then not having any carbohydrates afterwards and having predominantly protein, is simply because when we actually just have protein on its own, you're actually going to help with mitochondrial biogenesis. And what that means is, creating more mitochondria, creating more mitochondria at the end of the day, getting better training adaptations, helping you become metabolically flexible, which means you can also, maintain more volume at a lower heart rate and a lower intensity, which means when it comes to the time where you're actually ready to, push it a little bit harder with those higher heart rate zones, you have better glycogen reserves too, and you can increase that intensity. And so when I was talking about that and the reason I do that, someone replied to me and he was saying, oh, hey mate, I actually noticed when I have carbohydrates, I get better times in training and I'm able to push myself harder. And he is absolutely correct when he said that, because he was kind of asking me, he's like, why can I do that? And the reason, there are times and place for both of these things, because carbohydrates are the reason we can push ourselves so hard. You're not going to be able to push your intensity as hard as you can without carbohydrates. So if you have, if you're kind of using fat as a fuel source or carbohydrates as a fuel source, carbohydrates are going to help push that intensity faster, simply because it's able to produce more energy quicker. All right, but we can't sustain that for a long period of time. So that's why, when you do your first initial amount of sprinting, or you push that high heart rate, if you're doing anaerobic work and things like that, it's predominantly carbohydrate dominant for the most part to use as an energy source. And it's simply because the energy does get regenerated, you are using the energy quicker, right? But you can only maintain it for a certain amount of time, because then what happens is you can't keep regenerating that energy, but it does allow you to push more intensely. So there is a time and place for both. And what I said to him, I said, okay, well, that's 100% true. You are going to be able to push yourself harder when you have carbohydrates, but it's like, what is your goal at the moment, and especially with what type of training he's doing. And if you're someone who's doing more endurance type of things, you aren't always going to be using carbohydrates as your main fuel source, and you actually want to be able to alternate between fats and carbohydrates, because what happens is when you are training in a lower intensity state, or a lower heart rate, should I say, or using fat predominantly as your fuel source, you're saving glycogen stores and, glycogen utilization. So when it actually comes to pushing that intensity at certain times of the race, and you push it harder and your heart rate goes higher, you have those glycogen stores spare, okay? So it's like, if we think about someone who's always, experienced cyclist versus someone who's not experienced, okay? And it's that final push, right? Now, let's say the experienced cyclist, he has been able to train himself so he can actually maintain a higher heart rate, probably about 70% of his heart rate, maybe even 75, and he uses fat as his fuel source. Whereas someone else uses predominantly carbohydrates as a fuel source, even though he's maintaining the same heart rate max, just because he's not used to it, right? And so because of this, when it comes to that last final push, the beginner may not have as many glycogen reserves, or even be able to push that intensity as high, because he's been using glycogen for the whole amount of time predominantly. He's also just been pushing himself harder overall, whereas the experienced athlete now has more glycogen reserves, which means when it comes to that final push, he's able to use those, and he can actually use those to advantage, and that can actually be a make or break deal at the end of the day. And that's why we want to have these periods of where you are going to train low, it's called, training low, and having periods of fasted training with a lower heart rate, and then also periods with carbohydrate based training. So they both do have their place. Just having a sip of my protein. So yeah, they both do have their place, but overall, I guess the most important thing that I want to kind of cover here is, even though they both do have their place, it really does depend on, what type of sport you're doing predominantly. A lot of endurance stuff is going to be more focused towards trying to have an alternate between using carbs and fat as a fuel source. And it's also, when you are training, especially if it's endurance-based things, a lot of your stuff should be in the lower intensity range for the most part. So if you want to be a better athlete overall, there's, you look at what the top athletes do. They don't train in the max all the time, and you can't, because you can't recover from it. It's very it's very muscle intense. It's very hard to sustain such a high output all the time, and that's why a majority of their training is predominantly low intensity. And then they have certain training bits where it's like, high intensity and medium intensity training, but for the most part, it is a lower intensity training based, and you can add more volume, right? You can stay in a lower heart rate, so you recover better, and you can repeat it again and again and again, so it's not as detrimental in the body. And you also, with that, you also become metabolically flexible, because there's like a saying, it's called like miles make mitochondria, right? So the more volume you can accumulate with endurance, and the longer you can go in that lower state, the more mitochondria you're going to build, and the better it's going to be for you overall. And so it's like, we want to focus a lot of I'd like to say like 80% of your training in the week should be at that low intensity training. And then, 20% should be that medium intensity to high intensity training where you do push the limit, and that's where it'll be more carbohydrate based, okay? So again, they do have their place, and based on what type of sport you're going to do is kind of going to depend on where you want to obviously get your fuel sources from, or utilize your fuel sources for the most part. But a lot of your training should be in that low intensity state. When I'm doing boxing compared to my other stuff, it's higher intensity. My heart rate goes a lot higher at the end of the day. I'm sitting between like 170 and like 180 for the most part. Like today I was absolutely just sweating bullets, and my heart rate was really high, but that's because I'm doing pad work, I'm going fast and trying to be intense. And so that's predominantly carbohydrate work. So it's like, I make sure that I have a big meal the night before, and I do have some carbohydrates this morning for that boxing intensity session, because that's a higher amount of heart rate. But with my swimming and my cycling, I'm sitting at like 140 to 150 beats per minute. So it's not that high, and it's predominantly lipolytic. So like I use fat as a fuel source, and I don't need glycogen reserves really at all. I'm not doing over an hour of training a day in regards to the cardio at the moment. So it's not going to start depleting any type of muscle glycogen. And again, because it's such a low intensity state, a majority of it is going to come from fat as my fuel source. And I'm going to be okay from that. I'm going to be able to recover. I'm not going to be as taxed during the day. And so it does just have these applications based on what type of sport you're going to be doing. All right. So it's just a consideration you guys want to think about when it does come to that, with, how intense your sport is. And that's also why I recommend a heart rate monitor, because you can monitor just how intense it is. Are you pushing your heart rates higher? And then the fitter you get, you'll realize the heart rate starts to drop lower, which means you actually are, the fitter you're becoming, the more likely you are going to be using fat as a fuel source before using glycogen as a fuel source, right? But again, intensity also does drive it. So once you start to push above 70 to 75%, if you're not experienced, it'll be above 65% of your heart rate max. Then you'll start using fat as a fuel source. Then you'll start using carbohydrates as a fuel source predominantly after that. And that's where it kind of just, the better you get trained, the more fitter you become, just the more metabolically flexible you are. And the more metabolic flexibility you have, the better you're going to be as an athlete overall, and going to be able to push yourself harder. Okay, so I hope that answered the listener question. It's a little bit informal, but I just wanted to touch base and get it out there before I forget about anything. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, make sure to hit me up on Instagram at Tyson the Trainer with 2 R's. And until next time, I'll speak to you then.